Something big is happening inside Sony right now. And if the latest wave of leaks is accurate, it could completely change how creators think about crop sensor cameras. We are talking about the Sony A6900, and after digging through every credible report, every supply chain whisper, and every insider claim currently circulating, it is becoming impossible to ignore how significant this camera might actually be. This is not a minor spec bump. This is not a camera that simply adds a new color profile or a slightly better grip. What is being described here is a fundamental shift in what a compact APS-C camera is capable of, and it is worth slowing down and walking through exactly why. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to 2023 when Sony released the A6700. That camera quickly became the default recommendation for creators who wanted strong autofocus, solid video specs, and a small form factor without paying full-frame prices. It held that position well, but ever since then, Sony has gone unusually quiet on the high-end side of its APS-C lineup. No true flagship crop sensor camera followed. For a while, that silence looked like retreat. Plenty of observers assumed Sony had simply decided to let Canon and Fujifilm fight over the enthusiast crop sensor space while Sony focused its energy on full-frame bodies like the A7 and A9 series. In hindsight, that assumption looks wrong. The quiet period appears to have been intentional, and the reason is now becoming clear. According to multiple leaks from sources that have historically been reliable on Sony's roadmap, the A6900 is expected to feature a brand new 33-megapixel stack sensor. On paper, that might sound like a routine spec update, but the implications go much deeper than the megapixel count. Stack sensor technology has, until now, been reserved almost exclusively for Sony's most expensive full-frame flagship bodies, the kind used by professional sports photographers and photojournalists who need blistering speed and zero compromise. Putting that same architecture into a compact, relatively affordable crop sensor body is a genuinely unusual move, and it signals that Sony is no longer treating APS-C as a secondary product line. So why does a stack sensor actually matter in practice? It comes down to how fast the camera can read data off the sensor. A traditional sensor scans the image line by line, from top to bottom, and that process takes a measurable amount of time. When you're shooting fast motion, whether that is a subject sprinting across the frame or you whip panning the camera during a run-and-gun shoot, that slow scan creates a skewing distortion commonly known as the jello effect. It is one of the most frustrating limitations of budget and mid-range mirrorless cameras, and it has been a deal-breaker for a lot of action and sports shooters who otherwise like smaller, lighter bodies. A stacked sensor solves this at the hardware level. It places high-speed processing circuitry directly underneath the light-capturing layer, which allows the entire image to be read almost instantly rather than progressively. That single design choice cascades into a long list of practical benefits: dramatically reduced rolling shutter in video, faster and more reliable autofocus tracking because the system is working with more current data, and blackout-free continuous shooting because the sensor and processor are not fighting a bottleneck. Speaking of continuous shooting, the numbers being reported for the A6900 are genuinely eye-catching. Leaks point to a burst rate of up to 30 frames per second when using the electronic shutter and 15 frames per second with the mechanical shutter. Those are numbers that would have been considered flagship sports camera territory just a few years ago. And now they are reportedly showing up in a camera that will likely retail for a fraction of what a full-frame sports body costs. If that holds true, wildlife shooters, event photographers, and sports content creators who have been priced out of high-speed full-frame bodies suddenly have a much more accessible option. None of this happens without serious processing power behind it, which is where the rumored BIONZ XR II image processor comes in. Reading a stack sensor at high speed generates an enormous amount of data, and that data has to be processed and cleared from the buffer quickly enough that the camera does not stutter or freeze during a long burst. This is one of those areas where the engineering challenge is invisible to the end user when done well, and painfully obvious when done poorly. A processor that cannot keep up shows up as a camera that locks up mid-shoot at the worst possible moment. Sony's challenge here is compounded by the fact that this is a small camera body, which means less physical room for heat dissipation. Cramming flagship-level processing power into a compact chassis without cooking the sensor or throttling performance is a genuinely hard problem. and how well Sony solves it will likely be one of the deciding factors in how this camera is received once it is actually in reviewers' hands. One of the more ambitious claims floating around concerns dynamic range. Some of the more optimistic leaks suggest the A6900 could deliver upward of 15 stops of total dynamic range, which would put it in serious competition with dedicated full-frame bodies when it comes to recovering detail in both bright highlights and deep shadows. If true, that would be a remarkable achievement for a crop sensor camera. It is worth applying a healthy amount of skepticism to a number like this, though. Dynamic range figures are notoriously dependent on testing methodology, and manufacturers tend to release the most flattering numbers from the most favorable test conditions. It would not be surprising if the real-world figure, once independently tested by outlets like DPeerReview or DxOMark, lands a bit below the rumored ceiling. Still, even landing in the 13 to 14 stop range would be an impressive result for this sensor class. It is also worth mentioning that Sony reportedly experimented with a 40-megapixel sensor during development before settling on the 33-megapixel configuration that is now being rumored. That detail matters because it tells you something about Sony's priorities here. A higher resolution sensor sounds appealing on a spec sheet, but more megapixels means more data to read, process, and store, which works against the speed and buffer performance that this camera is clearly being built around.